Right. Now, I'd like to welcome all of us here tonight, and particularly to Pete for agreeing to come and talk to us. Um, so Pete has been a little bit about Pete that he's passed on. He's been working in nature conservation for over 40 years. So I think that thing that said his 50th birthday was only a couple of years ago must have been wrong, unless it was child labour. But for most of the time, he's managed nature reserves, and for the last 23 years, managing inch marshes. That must be a good record. So you'll know all about inch marshes
I will.
and what happens there. That's good. But why you're here tonight is to talk to us particularly about butterflies and moths. Um, and I suppose the botanical associations. It's interesting. Sometimes when we go out with Mary Eaglesham, she tells us that this is the plant this particular butterfly feeds on or lays eggs on, and sometimes we're looking for the eggs, which is challenging. I would imagine you do that all the time. So anyway, thank you very much for agreeing to give us a talk, and we'll look forward to what you say with interest. Over to you.
Okay, thank you. Well, some of you will be aware I had a bit of a technical hitch earlier that I've completely lost internet today from my laptop. But fortunately, I'd sent a copy of my presentation to Audrey beforehand, and so I'm joining the meeting on my mobile phone, and Audrey's going to do the slides for me. So yeah, just a wee bit of background was that I've been particularly interested in butterfly moths over the last, I don't know, 10, 15 years, 15 years, I guess. And that's kind of superseded my interest in birds to some extent. And Audrey suggested I maybe would like to do a talk on butterflies and plants and their association. I had no idea what I was going to do for this. But when I started to put it together, of course, realized that there are so many associations between butterflies and moths and plants that there was just a wealth of stuff I could have mentioned. So I've kind of honed in on some of the projects that I've been working in. So some of it's a bit of a personal story for me. Anyway, so just to start, so one message I think you probably take away from this is that you can be a very good botanist without knowing much about butterflies and moths, but you can't be a good lepidopterist without also being something of a botanist. And hopefully, during the course of this talk, that will become clear. So, Audrey, would you like to share your screen?
Yep. Hopefully that will be it. Slideshow. Is that it showing large now?
Yes.
Okay.
That's fine. Just had to change my specs. Okay, so when you ask someone to think about the relationship between butterflies and plants, usually the first thing that comes into your mind is this next slide, please, Audrey. So classic butterfly nectaring on a flower. This is a red admiral on Michaelmas daisy, and that is the kind of archetypal association between flowers and butterflies that you think of. Next, please. But of course, we have moths as well. So moths also nectar on flowers, But because they're doing it mostly at night, we're not so aware of it. And so we tend not to have the moth flower relationship in our heads so much as the butterfly flower relationship. So this is a day flying moth, actually. This is narrow bordered bee hawk moth, and it's feeding on Aubrietia. And this was actually taken at the back of our house. So next, please, Audrey. And here's another day flying nectar feeding moth. This is the hummingbird hawk moth. And you'll maybe notice both this and the narrow bordered bee hawk moth we just seen. They both hover when they're feeding, which is something that butterflies can't do. Butterflies have to land on the flower and then stick their proboscis into the nectar tube, whereas these two moths are obviously capable of hovering while they're feeding. Next, please, Audrey. So generally, any flower with nectar will do for butterflies and moths. You tend not to get a relationship between a particular butterfly or a particular moth and a flower because, yeah, any old nectar is good nectar. Obviously, some flowers produce more nectar than others, so some are favored by butterflies and moths just because they have more nectar. But in this particular case here, you can see this is convolvulus hawk moth, and it's feeding on Nicotiana. And this is a very well-known relationship with mothers because convolvulus hawk moth is a very rare hawk moth that we can see in Britain in the winter, in the autumn. And this one was photographed by Roy Leverton in his garden in Banffshire. And you'll see again, it's a hovering moth. And the thing about Nicotiana, it has quite a long nectar tube. So only a moth with a long proboscis can get in there and reach down into the nectar source. So most moths would not be able to feed on this flower because they haven't got long enough proboscises to reach the nectar. So this is an example of how a moth and a flower kind of have a close association. And the flower is actually, by having such a long nectar tube, it's actually excluding a lot of pollinators, and it's specifically going for moths. And it's a flower that puts out its scent, particularly at night. So there are a few flowers that do this. I mean, a really obvious one would be night-scented stock, a garden flower, and that produces its smell mostly at night. And so that tells you it's trying to attract moths rather than butterflies. A honeysuckle would be another one that puts out a particularly intense smell at night. Next, please, Audrey. So a classic association between moth and flower was in 1862, Charles Darwin was sent an example of a Madagascan star orchid, and he's noticed that it had a 30-centimeter long nectar tube. And at the time, no one knew of a moth with a 30-centimeter long proboscis. That is one hell of a length. And 5 years later, the famous naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace predicted that it was probably pollinated by a type of sphinx moth because they were found on the African mainland, and he thought probably it would be a similar species of that because they were known to have long proboscises. Anyway, it was 41 years after Darwin had been sent this star orchid that they actually discovered the moth that was nectaring on it and hence pollinating the orchid. And it was named Wallace's Sphinx moth because Wallace was the one that thought it would be a type of Sphinx moth. And if you look at the Latin name there, Xanthopan predictor, the predictor bit is because he predicted that there would be a moth with a 30-centimetre long proboscis. But as I say, it was 40 years before anyone actually discovered which the moth was, or that there was a moth with a 30-centimetre long proboscis. So brilliant story. Audrey, next. So there's a museum specimen, I assume, and that's a Sphinx moth with its proboscis fully extended. So that's a relationship, obviously, that has developed between the moth and the orchid, such that the orchid couldn't do without the moth because nothing else is likely to pollinate it. And obviously the moth, well, I don't know that the moth needs the orchid because it doesn't have to extend its proboscis fully, I guess, but when it's feeding. But this one, obviously, there's a very good relationship between the two. Next. So, as it happens, not all moths feed on nectar. So we have a small group of micro moths. So for those of you, if you're not familiar with the term micro and macro moth, it's a rather arbitrary split of moths into the small ones and the big ones, although there is some overlap. And it's actually the micro moths that have some of the particularly interesting relationships with flowers, with plants. And this is one of a handful of species we have in Britain that is actually a pollen muncher. So this moth actually has mouth parts designed for chewing, whereas all butterflies, and in their adult stage at least, and most moths are just able to drink. So obviously specifically nectar, but these ones can actually pollen munch instead. Next, please. But I think probably one of the most interesting relationships comes about looking at the larval stage of butterflies and moths, because although most adult moths and butterflies will nectar on anything, obviously their larvae or their caterpillars are sometimes very, very specific to one plant species. So these are peacock larvae feeding on nettle. Next, please. And this is the gorgeous emperor moth larva. This moths have to use camouflage a lot, or at least moth larvae have to use camouflage when they're feeding on plants. So you can see that the emperor moth, in its final stages of the larva, the green blends in well with the background, and it feeds mostly on heather, although it can feed on a range of other kind of woody plants. But those little pale brown dots on the body, I always think they break up the visual look of the moth larva, and they do look a bit like the little brown dried heather seeds that you get on heather plants. So I think it blends itself really well into heather. Next, please. So these are micro moths, so these are quite tiny things, and many micro moths are restricted to having a food plant of just one species. So by food plant, I mean the plant that the caterpillar feeds on. So here you've got some names that give you an idea what food plants are. So up in the top left there, Anacampsis populella. Locally, that is an aspen feeder, aspen being a type of poplar, of course. I mean, it will feed on other poplars, but in this area, we've really only got aspen as our member of the poplar group. So bird cherry ermine, well, obviously the English name is a big giveaway there. That lays its eggs and the larvae will feed purely on bird cherry ermine. So that's the one that covers the, you can see whole bird cherries covered in larval webs in the summer. So these larval webs are actually spun by the caterpillars themselves, and they hide up in these larval webs during the day so that they're not predated by birds. And then they sneak out and feed on the bird cherry leaves after dark. So moving down to the bottom, you've got Neofaculta ericatella. No prizes for that. Guessing that's a heather feeder. Excuse me. And Leucoptera laburnella, absolutely gorgeous wee thing, but it's only like about a couple of millimeters long, so it's easily overlooked. And that feeds exclusively on laburnum. So it's obviously not a native to the UK, but we have so many laburnums around that in people's gardens that it has become very well established in the UK. Next, please. And caterpillars, I've mentioned, they need to camouflage themselves well against the plant they're feeding on. And a lot of them are nocturnal feeders, which again reduces the chance of them being predated. And another way they can protect themselves is by making these larval cases. So this is a group of micromoths, the Coleophora, and the adult Coleophora all look very, very similar. So they're really impossible to identify just by looking at the adults. So, but when they're in their larval stages, the larvae spin these fairly distinctive looking larval cases. The cases are made up of plant material that the larva has been feeding on. So on the left there, you've got Coleophora discordella, which feeds on bird's-foot trefoil, as you can see, and Coleophora viticella is feeding on cowberry. And the viticella obviously comes from the Latin name for cowberry, Vaccinium vitis idea. And so if you're a mother, and as I've mentioned, you can't identify the adult moths just by looking at them because they all look the same. But if you look for these larval cases, and some of them can look a bit similar, but what really makes you get the right identification is linking what that larval case looks like with what it's actually attached to. So you need to know your plants so that you can actually identify these moths in their larval stage. Next, please. So this is why, well, there are two species of Coleophora that have larval cases on the flower heads of rushes. They'll feed on different species of rush, and I dare say most of you will have seen these little white cases on rush flowers. I'm sure I'd been seeing them for years before I actually twigged to them being micro moth larval cases. So you've got the two species names there. You can't tell which it is just by looking at the larval case, but you know it's one of them. And And in fact, you see those larval cases all over the place where you get rushes. Next, please. So some micro moths, the larval stage protects itself by living completely inside the two layers of a leaf. So you've basically got two outer layers of the leaf with a bit of a space in between. And actually, I don't have a cursor to show, but I don't know. Audrey might be able to use hers. So the narrow bit of the dark line there is where the egg of that caterpillar would have been laid, and then it eats its way into the inside of the leaf, and then it moves along through the two leaf layers, feeding, and it's gradually getting bigger and bigger as it goes. And all the black stuff in there is caterpillar poo, otherwise known as frass. And you can see that the tunnel through the leaf is gradually getting bigger and bigger as the caterpillar gets bigger. And then eventually it gets obviously to the size where it's ready to pupate. And it then eats its way through the surface of the leaf and will often drop down to the ground on its silk thread, and it will pupate on the ground amongst leaf litter or in the soil. Next, please. So here's another one. I don't actually know what that previous one was actually in terms of the moth species, but this is Stigmella titirella, as you see, and this is a beech feeder. So this will be a beech leaf. If you follow the little thin black line down along, it runs along the main rib of the beech leaf, and apparently the female of this species of micromoth always lays the egg in a junction between the main central leaf rib and one of the side veins. And then, which is, if you can see Audrey's cursor there, that's where the egg's laid. As I say, the little larva, when it hatches out, eats its way into the leaf and then eats its way through between the leaf layers. Again, gradually getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and then eventually popping out of the leaf. So again, you don't actually need, well, you won't be able to identify these larvae if you saw them outside of the leaf, because they're all going to look much the same. And so you can actually identify them on the basis of what species of plant leaf they're feeding in, coupled with the actual shape of the mine. So these are called leaf mines, and some of them have very distinctive shapes. And this one, where it's like bouncing around between the two veins, is fairly distinctive for this species. Next, please. And again, we've got another leaf mine on the right there. And so again, looking at the Latin name of it, Coleophora arctostaphylli, that is, of course, bearberry. So Arctostaphylus uva ursi is bearberry, as you all know. So, and then the one on the left there, Phalaenoptera leucographella. It's not named after the plant, but it just shows a different type of leaf mine. So this is known as a blister mine. But again, if you know it's a blister mine, you know what plant it's on, then you can have a good guess at what the species of micromoth is. So that one, look at my notes. Well, I don't know what plant that is. Actually, do you know? No, don't recognise what that plant is. I think that one, Phalaenophyta leucographella, will feed on a whole range of different plants, actually. So that might not narrow it down too much. Anyway, next, please. So, ragwort. You'll know that ragwort is very attractive to moths and butterflies to feed on, well, to nectar on. Next, please, Audrey. And there's a very close relationship between this moth, the cinnabar moth, and ragwort, because I think ragwort is its only food plant. And the larvae that you can see clustered here on a bit of ragwort have this warning yellow and black coloration. And that's because they accumulate toxins from the ragwort. Presumably, it's the same toxins that are poisonous to grazing livestock. And the larvae accumulate these toxins, and if birds come along or other invertebrates come to eat them, they are very sick. And the adult moth there, gorgeous black and red, that's also a warning coloration to birds that it is toxic, so not to eat it. The only time I've ever witnessed a what you could call a plague of caterpillars was many years ago. I worked down in Suffolk, and it was on a nature reserve where they had lots of abandoned agricultural fields as part of the reserve. And the fields were just absolutely chocker with ragwort, like wall-to-wall ragwort. And all the cinnabar moths went absolutely mental over it because there was so much food. And these fields were just like heaving with cinnabar moth larvae. And the larvae would eat, they ate all the leaves, and then they started eating the stems. And then eventually you were just left with these little blackened stems of ragwort sticking up out of the ground, where the whole rest of the plant had been eaten by the larvae. And there were still loads of larvae on them. And so the larvae all went off in search of more ragwort. And the pathways around on the reserve were just covered in these cinnabar moth larvae. They were all just heading out, searching for more ragwort and not really finding it. But you couldn't even walk along any of the paths without treading on these lovely black and yellow larvae. So they can be in absolutely plague proportions at times. Unfortunately, we very rarely see them. Well, we don't see them around Strathspey, where I stay, although they are up the east coast of Scotland and, in fact, in south west part of Highland as well, but just not in this central area. Next, please. So you'll recognise this as one of the so-called cabbage whites. This is large white, and it's caterpillar, and I don't need to tell you what they feed on. But when they're not munching cabbages, they'll also feed on a range of what are they? Yeah, well, cultivated brassicas of any type, but also they'll feed on garlic mustard, hedge mustard, nasturtium, a range of species. And the large white larvae, I think they look fairly camouflaged, but the book tells me they're not particularly camouflaged, and they don't need to hide away because they also are toxic to predators like birds. And these accumulate mustard oils from the brassicas, and so it's the mustard oils that make them taste horrible. Next, please. So this is northern brown Argus butterfly, and its food plant is bird's foot. Sorry, it's not bird's foot traveler. It's rock rose. Next, please. So the butterfly will lay these little, quite distinctive eggs on the top side of a rock rose leaf. And so because the butterfly itself is only going to be flying when the weather's really nice, one of the best ways of surveying for northern brown Argus is actually to go and look for eggs at the end of the season on the rock rose leaves. So basically, I mean, rock rose, you'll know, has a fairly restricted distribution. So if you know where your rock rose is, you can just go and find a patch, get down on your hands and knees, have a search through, and you are more likely to see eggs than you are to see the actual adult butterfly. Next, please. So this is small blue. It's nectaring there on wild thyme. It too has a sole food plant. Next, please. So this is kidney vetch. And in fact, move on one, Audrey, please. You may just see in the middle of that. Yes, well done. There is a kidney vetch flower with a small blue egg just stuck in the middle of it. And when the egg hatches, it will feed on the developing seed of the kidney vetch. Next, please. So when yes, okay, this map shows you both where there is this kidney vetch, yeah. Yes, this is kidney vetch. So the blue dots are where there's kidney vetch and where small blue has been found. And the red dots are where there's kidney vetch, but no small blue has been found. So actually, there should be a blue dot on the River Dolnan there near to Carbridge. So one of those red dots has gone blue. Yes, well done. So obviously you can see, well, obviously there's a close tie-in between the flower and the butterfly. And one year, Hilary, my wife, and I, we went over to Glen Arn. So you can see there running north and south from Tomintoul. You've got kidney vetch along the River Arn. And small blue has never been seen in Glen Arn. So we went to have a look and we found loads of kidney vetch, particularly in the mid sections of the Arn, but we never saw any small blue. So why it's in the Spey Valley but not in Glen Arn, I don't know. But this is a classic example of, if you want to go and look for this species of butterfly, you have to know its food plant and know where its food plant is. So that's where it gets very useful to be able to go to your local BSBI recorder and get some maps of where the food plants are, and that gives you a good idea where to look. Next, please. So this is the absolutely gorgeous small copper butterfly, one of my favorites. Next, please, Audrey. And the small copper feeds on sorrels. So either common sorrel, as you have on the left, or sheep sorrel, as you have there on the right. Next, please. And if there's no sorrel around, it will also use broadleaf dock. But I think it will use sorrels in preference. So you will find this with some butterflies and moths. They'll have a favoured food plant or two, but if pushed, they will actually use other species. And it's a bit of a game amongst lepidopterists to try and find something feeding on a plant that it hasn't been recorded as feeding on before. Next, please. So this is common blue on the left and dingy skipper on the right. They both have bird's foot trefoil as their food plants. Next, please. And there, of course, is bird's foot trefoil, looking gorgeous. Next, please. So, bird's foot trefoil, of course, is a very widespread species of plant. So you might perhaps expect that the butterflies whose larvae feed on it are also going to be widespread. But it's very rarely the case that the distribution of the plant actually gives you the distribution of the moth or the butterfly. There are obviously a lot of other factors come into play. And one of the things with dingy skipper, this is the distribution map for dingy skipper, is that you see that mostly it's coastal and otherwise only really found much up the Spey Valley. And where you find it is on sort of sandy, gravelly areas. So like through the most of the highlands where you've got a lot of peat, you're just not going to see it. It needs this kind of bare ground. It's needing heat. So it either gets the heat along sandy coastlines, as you can see there along the Murray coast, or inland where you've got sandy, gravelly, glacial deposits, or even forestry tracks that have been made on glacial deposits. Next, please. So I've been very much involved last year with a project under the Nature Restoration Fund, where we got a load of money to open up some forest tracks. This is at a place called Gorrish, near to Boat of Garten in Strathspey. And below left, you've got, that's one of the old woodland tracks, which has just become completely overgrown with, mostly broom actually, but there's also pines growing in there as well. And so we hired a digger to come in and scrape off all the invading scrub to leave these very open, sandy, gravelly tracks. And the dingy skipper butterfly needs these open, sandy areas to get warm enough to be able to live, basically, to be able to breathe. Next, please. So having cleared these tracts of vegetation, and you can see there how sandy the ground is, that's me sowing bird's foot trefoil seed mixed with sand onto the track. So this happened just last autumn, so I'm hoping that we're going to get a load of bird's foot trefoil germinate this spring, and attracting a load more dingy skippers. So dingy skipper is found along this particular track system, but it's just dotted in little pockets where it's still fairly open. And so we've cleared about 2.5 kilometers of track. So there's going to be lots of potential for bird's foot trefoil to grow there, and for the dingy skippers to spread. My only concern is that there's lots of broom and gorse and birch and pine around, and they're all naturally seeding into these bare track areas as well. So it might be a bit of a fight to keep them at bay and let the bird's foot trefoil grow up. Next, please, Audrey. So the gorgeous checkered skipper. Next, please. The checkered skipper, its food plant is purple moorgrass. So you may think, well, we've got loads of purple moorgrass in Scotland. It should be a very common butterfly. But in fact, again, it needs warmth, and so it's found in the west and not at all in the east or the north. And more than that, the larvae take so long to develop during the summer, munching their way through purple moorgrass, that the purple moorgrass, if it's not in a really damp place, actually starts dying off for the winter before the larva has become large enough to survive the winter. so the butterfly selects out not just any old purple moorgrass, but purple moorgrass that is growing in very damp hollows or next to ditches, somewhere where it's going to stay really damp and stay green for longer through the year. So again, knowing where to find your butterfly is knowing what food plant it feeds on, but also is there anything in particular about that species of food plant that makes it a host in a particular place. Next, please. So lots of brown butterflies. So we've got meadow brown there on the left and Scotch Argus on the right. A lot of brown butterflies are grass feeders. So you would think they would have no problem at all finding loads of food. Next, please. But in fact, the young larvae tend to feed on fine leaf grasses. So we've got sheep's fescue there on the left, and then as the presumably they just need finer, softer leaves when they're really tiny caterpillars. But as they get bigger caterpillars, they can munch their way through tougher stuff. So on the right there, we've got cocksfoot. So meadow brown, for example, the caterpillars will start off on these sheep's fescue leaves, and then they move on to the cocksfoot later. So they're kind of needing a mix of grasses growing near to each other. Next, please. I had it in my head that thistle would host a whole load of butterfly species and moth species because it's obviously resistant to being munched by grazing animals. So obviously there's a risk when you're a caterpillar that you'll get munched along with the leaves. So, but in fact, next please, Audrey. I realised there was only one butterfly I knew of that would actually feed on thistle, and that was the painted lady. It seems surprising. I would have thought more would. Next, please. The same can't be said of nettles and species that feed on them. So on the left there, we have several very common and well-known butterfly species that will feed on nettle. And on the right there, we have several moths. There will be more moths that feed on nettles. This is just an example. Next, please. You'd have thought also nettle would be quite resistant to grazing animals, but I'm not sure how true that is actually. And you kind of think of caterpillars going for nice, big, soft, fleshy leaves, but there are loads of moth caterpillars that quite happily munch away on conifers. Next, please. So a particularly well-known one in the Inverness area is the pine tree lappet moth. So it's quite a huge brute, and it was only first discovered when I think it was 2007, just on the edge of Inverness. Next, please. And it caused quite a stir because it feeds on pines, and on the continent, it sometimes can be a bit of a pest, and it can become so numerous that the caterpillars can actually defoliate whole areas of pine forest. Um, so the Forestry Commission, as it was at the time, got very hot under the collar about this. And they were all set to go out and spray toxic chemicals on the woodland where this moth was found. But lepidopterists made the case that was it actually a pest that had just come in on timber, or as this newspaper article of the time suggests, they think it came in with Polish workers who were working in the forest, and it came in either in their cars or in their clothes. The truth is, if it did come in, no one knows how it came in, but there is a case argued for it being an overlooked native moth. And if that's the case, then it's very rare because it's only found in one small area near to Inverness. And so the Forestry Commission had to put their chemicals away as the debate went on. Next, please. And well, just to finish off the story, yeah, so it's had a reprieve from the chemicals, and there is no evidence one way or the other whether it's been introduced or whether it's an overlooked native, but it's obviously not spreading, if much at all, and yeah, the caterpillar is quite few and far between, so it's not going to be an issue. Right, moving on to bracken. There's something else you think, is that very tasty to eat? And here's a bracken specialist. This is brown silverline's moth, and it only eats bracken, or at least its larvae only eat bracken. And as you can imagine, it's super abundant wherever you've got bracken, particularly in the west where it's a bit warmer. Next, please. Another thing that has bracken as an essential part of its life cycle, but it doesn't actually feed on it, is the pearl-bordered fritillary. So this is a rare moth that's, well, sorry, butterfly. Thank you. Hillary's here putting me right. So it's very rare, and the numbers are declining at quite a rate. And what it needs is, well, the food plant is violet, so that's what caterpillars are actually eating. But you only find it where you also get bracken growing, because the caterpillar needs to be very hot in order to have the energy to feed on the violets. And where you get a layer of bracken litter, the temperature apparently can be, particularly when the sun shines, it can be something like 20 degrees warmer amongst the bracken litter than it actually is in the air around. So the larvae, which are also very dark, almost black in color, they hang around in this bracken litter where they get nicely warmed up, and their black coloration also helps absorb sunlight. And once they're warm enough, they can trundle to the nearest violet and munch away. So it's interesting that they require bracken, even though they're not actually feeding on it. Next, please. So these are two very common butterflies. You've got green veined white on the left, orange tip on the right. Next, please. And they actually, well, both have a bit of a range of food plants, but one of the most commonly seen food plants for both species is lady's smock. And you can see here, there's an orange tip egg on the stem underneath the flower. And you just get the one egg laid because that caterpillar, when it hatches out, will feed on the developing seeds of the flower head. And so the orange tip will generally just lay the one egg on a flower stem so that there's no competition between the baby caterpillars. And the green-veined white also lays its eggs on lady smock, but the caterpillars of the green-veined white eat the leaves, not the seeds. So the two species of butterfly can share the same food plant, but they're not competing with each other. One eating the seeds and the other eating the leaves. Next, please. This is green hair streak, absolutely unmistakable with its gorgeous fluorescent green undersides. Those are its food plants. And I always think, how come they're so different to each other? If the caterpillars can eat blaeberry and then gorse and then crossleaf heath, they're just so different. You can understand if they'll eat different species of plant that are related, but these are just so different in texture and structure. I'm amazed that you've got one species of butterfly will use any of those. I think blaeberry is its most commonly used food plant in the Highlands anyway. Next, please. So this is bearberry. Next, please. Bearberry is a food plant for quite a few rare moths. So we have netted mountain moth on the left and small dark yellow underwing on the right. And both of them are pretty much confined to the Cairngorms, but with an outlier in Easter Ross, near to Everton, as it happens. And myself and Butterfly Conservation have been doing a project with the Nova 2 wind farm, where they are actually stumping up money to try and increase the amount of bearberry on the site of the wind farm. So we've paid for contractors to go in and clear regenerating pine trees to keep it open and to clear some of the track sides. Bearberry obviously can only grow where it's quite open, exposed ground. It doesn't compete very well. And if heather gets a foothold, it will shade out the bearberry. So we're doing management for bearberry there. And just of interest, another part of the project is the wind farm are paying for Butterfly Conservation to investigate an upland flower mix, a pollinator mix, that can be sown along the sides of the tracks in and around the wind farm, because there's like loads of kilometers of tracks. And so the idea is to try and plant a hardy seed mix along the sides of the track. Next, please. Aspen. I'm not going to say much of this because I know the time's getting on. Next, please, Audrey. There are quite a few specialist aspen feeders. Here's a few. Poplar hawk moth, dark border beauty at the top right, and lead-coloured drab bottom right. These are all moths, of course. Next, please. I've been involved with a lot of monitoring of dark border beauty moth. It's only found currently in two established sites in Scotland only, and one site in England. At the Scottish sites, the caterpillars feed on aspen suckers, so you don't find them on mature aspen trees. You only find them on the low suckers, like you've got in this photograph in the foreground. Next, please, Audrey. And so not only are they selecting out the suckers, but they tend to feed on the freshest, softest leaves of the suckers. So the suckers have this kind of a bronzy color when the leaves are very fresh. And so these are the leaves that the caterpillars aim for. Yes, please, Audrey. So even within one plant, they're seeking out particular leaves or a particular growth form of that plant. Our assumption is that the physical and chemical characteristics of the sucker leaves are different to the leaves on the mature trees. This is just dark border beauty moth larvae. They feed at night, and in the day they pretend to be sticks. So you can see how well camouflaged they are amongst the aspen suckers. Next, please. And another project I've been involved with is this is Glen Tilt, just north of Blair Athol, and it's the only site in the UK for a small micromoth called silver shade. And yeah, next please, Audrey. So there it is, Iana argentana, and not the most beautiful of looking moths, is it? But anyway, super, super rare. It was discovered in Glen Tilt in the late 1800s, and it's never been found anywhere else, even though people have looked in many places. And so until recently, no one had ever seen either the caterpillars or the eggs of this species in the UK. So a couple of the adults were captured and taken into captivity, and the females were seen to lay eggs on two species of plant in particular. They laid eggs on they were given a choice of plants that they could lay eggs on, and they chose to lay eggs on the underside of bird's foot trefoil leaves and on the top side of alpine lady's mantle. Next, please. So a team then went out and crawled all over the hillside on hands and knees looking for eggs, which had never been seen before, and in the wild, that is. And here they are, the only eggs that have ever been seen in the wild, spotted by a young friend of ours called Holly. And being a young person, she's got cracking eyesight, and so I wasn't surprised she was the one that discovered them. So we still haven't seen caterpillars, so that's going to require even more visits to try and find them. But at least we've seen eggs. So again, it's showing how you need to know the link between the moth and the plant, so that you know where to look. Next, please. This was an interesting little project I was involved in. Polar clearwing is a moth that's never been seen in the UK, but on the continent, it feeds on these mountain willows, downy willow and woolly willow. And someone reckoned that it might be in the UK, but just overlooked, because clearwings are well, they're very hard to see even where they are. So we, several of us got hold of pheromones for this species. And so we had to know, where are we going to put the pheromone? So the pheromones are chemicals that will attract the moth. So I went to my local BSBI guru, Andy Amphlett, got to know where all the downy willows were in the area. Next, please, Audrey. And this is not in Scotland. This is natural willow habitat in Norway and Sweden. This is actually taken in Sweden, but you can see similar habitat in Norway. Next, please. So that's what I was expecting to find rather naively when I saw, oh, there are hundreds of plants of downy willow growing up one of the valleys at Craig Meggy, down near Loch Lagan. So I went into this valley and I was like thinking, okay, where are they? And they're actually in that photograph, but they're all so stunted that you can't really see them. Next, please. So I did eventually locate, there we have a downy willow growing on the edge of a burn. And that bit of plastic in it is not rubbish, but that's actually my pheromone trap. And the idea is it's a bit like a lobster pot. They can get in, but they can't get out. So you have your chemical in the middle and a hole at either end, and you hope you'll attract your moth in. Unfortunately, when I went back after a few days, my trap had gone, and we'd had this ferocious storm during the night, and I think my trap had blown out of the bush and into that burn, and probably ended up in Loch Lagan. So it was a bit disappointing, because I was really hoping to be the first person in Britain to see a polar clearing moth, and no one else who put traps out saw them either. But again, it just shows you, to be a good mother, you've got to be a botanist as well. Next, please. I am getting near the end. This is my final project. So you'll recognize this as the flower of lesser butterfly orchid. And in the middle of the flower there, you have the pollinia, the pollen-bearing structures. And so you know it's lesser butterfly rather than greater butterfly because they are parallel to each other. And next, please, Audrey. And it is known that moths will pollinate lesser butterfly orchid. And so what I did with a friend, Mike Taylor, was we set up moth traps in the Flowerfield orchid meadow down near Botany Garden. And we caught moths in the trap, hopefully after they'd been pollinating the orchids. And we wanted to know what orchids they'd been pollinating. So these pollinia, they're designed when an insect sticks its head in the flower, these pollinia break off and stick to the insect, in this case, the moth. And each of these different species of orchid has different shaped pollinia. So you can see the lesser butterfly orchid looks a bit like a bog brush. So that's what we were looking for on the moths. So next, please, Audrey. So there is actually that's a 6 spot burnet moth. This wasn't one that we got at Flowerfield, but it's just to show you the pollinia stuck to the proboscis of that 6 spot burnet. So it's sticking its tongue into the flower to get to the nectar, and the pollinia are getting stuck on it. So that's one's presumably visited several flowers because it's got several pollinia stuck to it. Next, please. So that's an example of what we're looking for. So we go through our moth trap, taking out the moths. This is an elephant hawk moth. That's me looking at it closely to try and see if it's got pollinia stuck on it. Next, please, Audrey. And hey presto, what do we have here? It's a shaded broadbar, but those pollinia are not bog brush shape. Those are actually fragrant orchid. So we kept on looking. Next, please. This is a beautiful golden Y, and you can see it's got several pollinia stuck around its front of its face and on its proboscis. And they are, again, the wrong shape for lesser butterfly. Those are fragrant orchids. Next, please. And this is a close-up of that beautiful golden Y moth. And there is a fragrant orchid pollinia stuck to its tongue. And I have to say, we wanted to find lesser butterfly orchid, and we didn't find any pollinia from lesser butterfly orchid. We just found several moths that had fragrant orchid pollinia, but no other species. So I think a number of mothers across Scotland were all working on this issue, and the decision that's been come to is that the pollinators of lesser butterfly orchid it's a group of moths. They're all kind of medium-sized moths, the same as the size as this beautiful golden white, and yeah, they're thought to be the main pollinators. Yeah, slightly disappointing in that we didn't get the result we were looking for, but absolutely fascinating to learn about orchid bulinia. Next, please, Audrey. And I'm 5 minutes overdue, but thank you very much for listening. And this is one of Hilary's photographs of a comma caterpillar feeding on elm in the middle of Granton, actually, in Granton Square. So the comma is the butterfly species that is expanding into the highlands at a rate of knots. So do look out for these very, very striking caterpillars. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was fascinating. I know virtually nothing about butterflies and moths, apart from they have their larval stages and things. But so you've increased my knowledge base massively. Fascinating for me to hear about them. But I think I've got too many questions. I think well, because I'm starting for such a low base, but maybe other people who know a bit more about butterflies and moths have questions they'd like to ask Pete.
Yeah, far away.
Can I kick off by asking about when you were saying about the small blue that wasn't found in Glenarm, but it was found in Strathspey. Could that be anything to do with sort of the microclimate thing and the width of the valley? Because Strathspey is a huge, great wide valley, and Glenarm looks on the map quite narrow and runs from north to south. Could it be that they don't get it? I don't know, I'm just speculating. Get enough heat?
Well, I don't know is the answer, but well, anything's possible. There are obviously climatic and geographical factors that could influence it. The flower survives there well, for sure. It could be something like that. I don't know. We'd have to find out from someone that knows about microclimates, wouldn't we? So you're thinking maybe like because Strathspey is more open, that it is warmer because it's
that would be that's what occurred to me just looking at the map. But I mean, I'm just speculating. I've no evidence either way.
No, interesting.
Knowing about like with checkered skippers, how much they like the early morning sun. If the similar thing applied to the small blue, or they weren't getting enough sunshine for long enough in the day because the valley, I don't know. It's just a thought.
Yeah.
I'm not expecting you to answer. I'm just, I don't suppose anybody knows.
Well, I'm just thinking, I mean, they are found on some of the tributaries of the Spey. So like up Glen Feshie and the River Dolnan, where actually it isn't so open.
It'd be interesting to look at the aspect and I don't know.
Yeah.
Just a thought.
Yes, it would. Yeah.
Somebody ought to wake Tessa up, or is she dead?
Any other questions?
Yeah, can I ask about finding these very tiny eggs? I presume you've always found them by actually having a very specific search. Does anybody ever sort of send in records saying, I found these eggs on something or other? It's been a bit by chance that they've sort of been looking at the flower or looking at the leaf and thought, oh, there's a little tiny white thing here, and investigated. Or is it always the sort of the butterfly experts going out and finding them?
In my experience, I don't think I've ever had anyone come to me and say, look, I found this egg on a leaf, what is it? It's always been, yeah, we've always gone out looking specifically for eggs. And yeah, it's quite a, I mean, some mothers will spend like hours looking for eggs or of a particular species they're interested in. Um, I, I find I haven't got the patience most of the time. Something like the northern brown argus, the eggs are quite easy to see, and you don't have to spend ages looking through a patch before you find out whether they're there or not. But yeah, I think, I mean, people must see eggs from time to time who don't know what they are, but they probably don't mention them because they've no idea what they are. They wouldn't even necessarily know they were a butterfly egg. They might think, oh, it's an egg of something else. I don't know what. So no, normally I'd have to go and search for them.
Thank you. So we're not so likely to see them when we're actually out botanizing. We'll identify the flower and admire it and move on.
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question? You said at the very beginning of the talk that moths hover while feeding and butterflies have to land to feed. So what is that, because of their wing structure, or why?
Yes. I mean, most moths do have to land to feed. The ones I showed were quite exceptional. There are only a handful of moths that can actually hover or do hover. I think, yeah, butterflies tend to be they've got like larger wings in relation to their bodies, and they've I'm not being at all technical here, but they just look much more sort of fluttery and slightly less in control of what they can do than some of the moths who are more compact. And I think of moths as being compact and quite muscular. And obviously, in the case of those, the hummingbird hawk moth, they are really well designed for hovering. So, yeah, if I gave the impression there are lots of moths that hover, that is completely wrong. There are only a few that hover.
Right. But it's only moths that hover. Only
Yes,
those few. Yeah, so butterflies never hover. Okay, that's it. And how would I distinguish between a butterfly and a moth?
Aha. It's a question I get asked a lot, and there's a very long answer and a very short answer. Really, you can't tell the difference. You have to know. It's like there are generalities. So in general, a butterfly flies by day, and moths at night. But then there are day-flying moths, and clubbed antennae is one of the things. So butterflies tend to have club-shaped antennae, whereas moths have feather-like or hair-like antennae that don't necessarily get wider at the end. But then again, you look at burnet moths, and they've got clubbed antennae. So whatever you come up with, there's not a hard and fast rule. The only difference, apparently, is that there's a little structure on the wings of moths where they can latch the hind wing and the forewing together using this little tiny structure. And you don't find that at all in butterflies. You only find it in moths. But you won't be able to see that if you're watching a moth or a butterfly. I mean, I've never knowingly seen it myself. So that's the only difference, and it's not one that you'll be able to see.
Right. So you just have to know what it is to identify it. Then you know, oh yeah, that's the moth, blah blah moth.
Yeah. You can have a good guess. So if it's flappy and colourful and it's in the day, it's almost certainly a butterfly. Because actually even the colourful day-flying moths not really very flappy. They're quite, yeah. Again, they're fast, little muscular things that, yeah, have a much more controlled flight than the butterflies.
Well, thank you. Yes.
Okay.
I'm amused by the muscular moths. Any other questions from folk? Nope, it doesn't sound like it's. Thank you very much. Anyway, I shall be looking for butterfly eggs when I'm examining the flowers. If I see any egg-shaped thing, I shall take a note of it. Don't
Yes,
quite know,
excellent.
do the note.
Yeah, I mean, some of the butterfly eggs are quite distinct. If you've got a really good photograph, you know they can be identified from the egg, especially if you know what the egg's on, of course, which you would. Yeah, if you've got a good camera that would take a nice close up of an egg, send it to Audrey, and she'll identify it for you.
Yep. Oh well. You never know. Don't hold your breath, Audrey, though. I'll be taking that many photographs for me with butterfly eggs. I'm not very good at photography, but you never know. Well, thank you very much, Pete. Pete, that was really fascinating to hear from you. I'm sure everyone else
It's good.
agrees. And yeah. So yes, I kind of clap from us.
Thank you.